being in these outdoor spaces, foraging, the overarching feeling that I feel is being at a family reunion. In one of those big family reunions where, you might be familiar with a few of your closest cousins and relatives, but, the other more distant ones, you don't quite know who they are and what their names are and their stories, but it's a joyous time, right? It's a joyous space to be there because you know that you are related to these individuals and that you're connected to them and that they care about you and you care about them. Lots of little friends. Oh, lots of little friends. Mm-hmm.
The natural environment of West Virginia has attracted people here throughout history. And we usually hear about people who came here from somewhere else, exploited the resources, and sent the profit somewhere else. But when Jonathan moved here, he connected to this place in a way that was just so enriching for those of us who've lived here our whole lives.
It's 3 right here. 3 for the whole tree, it looks like.
Growing up in the suburbs in Maryland, he never thought he'd find himself living in central Appalachia. But through hunting and foraging in these mountains, he found community, and he found family here. And not just in the humans that live here.
I think it's really awesome and a different way to think about my relationship with non-human relatives, to think about when to expect them, right? And so in the spring, in Appalachia, in West Virginia, thinking about foraging, the things that I am really excited about are ramps and morels, right? Getting out into the woods and, trying to see when is the right time, and is this the right time to pick those. Nothing like it. Nothing like it. I feel like that first one is like so key.
It is, yeah. Yeah, where you see one, there's more. Jonathan and I first met because of our common interest in wild food. Almost right away, he started coming out to the farm, often with his family, his wife Audra, and their kids. And what stood out early on was the way that he stressed how we are related to these plants and animals we were harvesting.
This is chickweed, right?
Chickweed, yeah. That's a really nice one in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an idea that has guided the native peoples of these lands for thousands of years.
This concept of thinking about non-human species as relatives, I think, is something that's really important. That way of thinking really creates the sense of humility that we need as a species to remember that we are the youngest. Before we were here, our mammal relatives were here, the beavers and deer, and before them there were plant relatives, the oaks and the maples and things. I try to keep that in mind when I'm, going through the forest and meeting new relatives and communing with others that I'm more familiar with. We were just in the woods now and, looking at the ants that were eating the oyster mushroom. Wow, the ants are really taking this, it's definitely being broken down. They weren't here. That's so fascinating. And both of those are older siblings. They've been doing that for many, many years, longer than I've been alive, certainly. And my great grand relatives have been around. So that's humbling.
In some of our earliest conversations, Jonathan talks so much about some of the indigenous scholars and activists and storytellers that he was reading and listening to. There was Robin Wall Kimmerer, Adrienne Keene, Kim Tallbear, and so many others whose words encouraged him to think about the importance of relations.
Oscar, those are ramps right there, those greens. Ramps.
In a state like West Virginia, which is so dominated by extractive industry, we learn that nature is just there for us to conquer for money and status. And we don't think about the consequences of taking too much, especially when we see humans and nature as these two unrelated things.
We're not going to eat those specifically. We're going to get some other ones to eat, okay? Yeah, there's more this way. Come on. When we begin to interact and be sustained by our wild relatives, we have the responsibility to make sure that they are being taken care of in a way that we can keep coming back to them and that they can keep coming back to us. It's sort of like an antidote to greed. So, that means not clear cutting, a forest to harvest the wood. That means not taking all of the pawpaws that are there, not taking all of the mushrooms that are there, and really getting to know those relatives in a way that you feel comfortable that relationship can be sustained. You care about the relatives that are sustaining you, and so you can't just liquidate their bodies and destroy their homes if you want to see them again, if you want to relate to them again.
That wisdom, that idea of relations is so fundamental to Jonathan's learning. So it becomes fundamental to his teaching. And teaching is what brought him here. He's a university professor, and he studies how people interact with land and wildlife in order to feed themselves. So wild food becomes the vehicle for his lessons. In the classroom, sure, but especially to his kids.
Hey, Oscar, come on, dude. Being out in these outdoor spaces and introducing non-human relatives to the young people in my life, my children, I think is probably the most important thing I can do. So for my children who are going to be 7 and 4 this year, I think it's so important for them at this early age where they are so receptive to knowledge, right? They're so interested and sort of have this disposition to learn things, to introduce them to as many relatives as I possibly can. Okay, let's keep moving, okay? Because just, the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, that village, at least for me, includes not just the humans, but the non-humans. Oh, haha. Found one. Mm-hmm.
Can I hold it?
Not yet. Hold on. Being able to introduce these relatives to your children, you also learn things about the young people in your life, right? Simone, our eldest, our daughter, has an incredible eye. Oh yeah, nice job, Simone. And the fact that she enjoys that, she's like, "Oh, I spotted a morel," Yeah, it's really wonderful.
I found it.
Well done, Simone. How did you see it?
I don't know. I'm gonna pick it.
Good job, Muffin Hunter.
Okay.
Oh, is that? Yep. Here's one. And there's one. Oh yeah. Yep, there's a bunch in there. Pop, pop, pop. And they're little chanterelles.
As much as Jonathan and I have in common, race has made us walk completely different paths to hunting and foraging.
So beautiful. Oops, spider.
For white people from mostly white rural communities, it is so easy for us to imagine that we all have the same experiences, we all have the same access, and that we're all treated the same in the outdoors. My personal safety is not something I have to consider when I'm on my land, when I'm on public land, or pretty much anywhere else. But for Jonathan, that is not the case.
That's a thing that I always think about, no matter where I am, no matter how many white folks are around with me. I'm thinking about what is going to happen when a white person who claims ownership on this space shows up and demands an explanation of why I'm there, right? Why is this black person in this space? The ways that blackness interacts with rural spaces in this country has always been contentious, traumatic, anxiety-inducing. Even when, out in the woods and experiencing things and having a joyful time, my consciousness about people who I don't know showing up in that space is always there. We were up on the hill a couple of times, and there's a fence there, right? And one of the thoughts that I, have in my head is, what will I do if the next person over rolls up on their four-wheeler and my white friends are not in view, right? And this person rolls up and sees a black person who they don't know, right, in their space. Like, what am I going to say? How are they going to react? And then how am I going to try to de-escalate the situation so that I can make it out of this space? And all of that thinking has this long, really sad, tragic, awful history attached to it that collectively as a American society we haven't really reconciled.
Some folks deny racism and say that his fears are completely unfounded. But read the news. If black people are killed when going for a jog, or reaching for a wallet, or trying to buy a toy gun at Walmart, then Jonathan has to think about the risk of being in the woods, especially when it's deer season and he has a real gun.
There's a lot that goes into being a person who's not expected into a space to get into it. I think, for most white people, it's just like, where is a space that I can go? I don't have to really worry about the other people that are there, the interactions or anything. I just need to find a space so I can go walking or go hiking. And then, sort of as a non-white person or a black person, you figure out who are the human relatives that you can trust to be in those spaces. Then comes like all of the other knowledge and things that you have to learn about your non-human relatives. So it's sort of like a whole category of stuff that black folks, non-white folks need to account for before we even get to the point where we're learning the names of plants that we don't know.
In order to understand these current realities, you have to understand that people were forced off this land. And after that, certain people were prevented from owning or accessing this land. And that all comes back to race. Every bit of that past goes into who is expected here and really who is even allowed to be in these places now. That's what Jonathan wants us to understand. He's opened a lot of eyes and started a lot of conversations that otherwise probably wouldn't have happened.
What I'm teaching my children, what my parents taught me, what my grandparents taught my parents, is that, the cost of not understanding those dynamics, the cost of not understanding the consequences of history, the cost of thinking that people look at you through a colorblind lens could be your life.
When you connect with somebody through food, you better eat, right? And when Jonathan comes over, we usually eat pretty well. Early on, he introduced me to this dish that really meant a lot to him.
It's a dish called inshima and relish. So the sort of like the main feature of the dish is this cooked cornmeal cake, right? And it's sort of like the starchy base that you pair with a stew. And so the stew is, a tomato and leafy green based stew with the meat and salted fish and onions and garlic and okra. You cook the stew and then you make this inshima cake, and you eat it with your hands, right? And you break off pieces of this inshima and dip it into the stew, and you eat it. And it's just a delicious, hearty meal. Sticks to your ribs and fills your soul and everything. Just so delicious. Inshima and relish was one of my favorite dishes growing up. We didn't have it very often, but whenever we did, it was a treat. We would sit on the floor, we would eat with our hands. It's a really special meal.
It's a dish his parents learned to make when they lived in Zambia. And I could really feel that personal significance when Jonathan talked about inshima and relish and all it represented for his family.
Both my mom and dad moved to Zambia, I think in the early 70s, and it was a really great time for them. My mother talks about how it was one of the happiest times in her life.
Hello.
Hey, Mama.
Hey.
Hey.
Sometimes he'll call his mom when he's making inshima and relish, and she'll talk about the way that she makes it, or she's made it in the past.
Well, when I used to make inshima for the three of us,
Yeah.
when I used to make the relish, I would start off by bringing to a boil about 2 cups of water.
Okay.
And it's almost like she's there in the kitchen, like they're cooking together.
And then I would measure about almost a cup of cornmeal
Okay.
into a measuring cup and put enough water in that to make it into a mixture.
Okay.
Pour that into the boiling water.
Okay.
Okay, son. And
I think for my parents, the food was one of the things that endured of their experiences that they could bring with them, right? And, in the same way that passing on experiences of being in these outdoor spaces are really important for me to pass on to my children, I think that was one of the things, the gifts that they could give me. Uh-huh.
and it will thicken,
Yeah.
but it will not be thick enough. And then you gradually add more cornmeal, but you stir it in, Jonathan, slowly.
Yeah.
And you stir it thoroughly.
Yeah.
And you continue to do that until it's so thick that it's very difficult to stir.
Mm-hmm.
And it will start once you let it.
So the inshima is just about ready, and the way that my mother would talk about it being ready was sticking a wooden spoon up, and if the spoon stays, then your inshima is ready. So the inshima is ready.
One time he got in touch with me and said he wanted to make this dish more personal. He wanted it to represent all the hunting, the foraging, the community he found here, all the relations that define his time in West Virginia.
I think that, the idea came from wanting to embrace Appalachia, West Virginia, in the ways that brought me joy in understanding this place. And of course, that was, this place will always be the place where I learned how to relate to my non-human relatives, right, in a really meaningful way. But then I think also it was an opportunity for me to express the gratitude that I feel for all the people who've allowed me to have this experience, right? The folks who I've hunted with and gone out and been on their land and done those things, who've taught me so much about, what it means to be in good relation with the environment here, I think is a really special thing. So yeah, there's just so much wrapped up in this.
At first it was a discussion. What are the ingredients? What are the stories that can connect this dish to this place? We had home canned tomatoes. These story-rich heirloom varieties that have been handed down in West Virginia communities for so many generations.
Tomato time.
And you can't have inshima and relish without the inshima itself, which is made from corn. So that was actually the first thing he asked me about. Can we make this dish with bloody butcher corn?
The interest in being able to make the inshima with bloody butcher corn was sort of like an anti-colonial sort of step, and to sort of like be conscious of this important plant that was, so much the agricultural and in many cases the economic backbone of many indigenous people here on these lands. Shelling this corn makes me think about the hands that spend a lifetime doing this. What do those hands feel like? What do those hands know about this process and the care that goes into taking care of members of the family by taking care of members of this family, this relative, this corn relative. If this dish is going to be meaningful, and it's going to be local, and it's going to be sort of paying homage to the humans who sort of created this space, then we need to think about the first humans who created this space for all of us. And, cooking this meal in Appalachia, and using a variety of corn that was cultivated here, again, like grounds this meal in this place. All right. Oh yeah. Not too fine, and it really adds to the kind of the silkiness of the stew that we're going to be dipping this into. So it's not only a flavor contrast, but it's a texture contrast that when it comes together just makes it really, really lovely. So this is perfect.
And then, of course, he wove in all the wild foods.
So this is one of my favorite wild plants, lamb's quarter. It's a relatively mild green, but it's just packed with nutrients. It holds up well to, just eating raw, but also in stews and cooking and everything. And, it's already a gorgeous color green, but when you put it in a stew or in liquid, it turns this really deep emerald green, and it's just so satisfying and delicious to eat. So I'm just excited that we have this for this dish, this inshima relish. It's just going to be fantastic.
The recipe for inshima and relish calls for salt-cured fish, so we used salt-cured trout. Salt trout was very common in certain parts of West Virginia until about the early 1900s. That's when commercial logging destroyed almost all of our trout streams, and this tradition was disrupted. In this ingredient is a lesson about what happens when we choose not to think about relations and reciprocity. It is the very kind of lesson Jonathan tries to teach through wild food. For the sausage, we ground venison we harvested, and we made our own. In that part of the stew, there is so much significance for Jonathan, but also for me because of those very different journeys that led to us hunting together.
Thinking about our hunt here and, harvesting my first deer, it feels like a slowly developing sort of like entity of thoughts and feelings and emotions, because it was such a powerful and special experience. We went through so much to get to that point. It comes to the surface every time I open my freezer and I see a piece of that deer that's there. Like it all bubbles up, all of it, the anxiety, the joy, the hard work, the pride, the gratitude, everything. It's a living memory.
You use the salted trout and what else?
And the deer sausage from the deer that I shot
Nice.
in December.
Some people love to debate what Appalachian food means. Would a Zambian stew be commonly accepted as an Appalachian dish? Well, why not? In every bite, there are rich stories and so many layers of meaning connected to place.
We crave stories, we create stories. And that's, I think, how we view the world and how we create meaning in the world. And the more enriching stories rooted in reciprocity we can create, the more we can fulfill our good relations on this planet, right? And, I think at the end of the day, food is about nourishing ourselves, not just our bodies, but like our sense and need to learn stories.
Jonathan's reverence for his many relations, for family, his respect for this place, for its people, for its past, all of those ingredients have been stewing and simmering for such a long time to make this possible.
For as long as I'm alive, cooking this food will automatically make me think of my parents. All of the stories that I built up over my lives with my parents. And even, the stories that I've received from them secondhand where I wasn't there to experience them. So it's sort of like a way to time travel and then to keep our treasured relatives alive with us. And that's what I want for my children, right? That's what I hope that this meal will do for them, to pass on as much of these stories that I can to them, so that they can build their own stories, right? For them to value inshima and then maybe make it in a different context, wherever they might be, in ways that are enriching and meaningful to them.